Aperture.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Chris Boot. I'm the Executive Director here at Aperture. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you, Gail and Amy, for being with us. If you're not familiar with Aperture, we're a not-for-profit foundation publishing books, publishing the magazine, creating public events and education programs, exciting audiences, old and new, with what photographers are up to, and doing that across multiple platforms. We are really delighted to welcome you, Gail, tonight. We've been working with you since 2006, I think, when we first published your work in Aperture magazine. And this is on the occasion of our first book with Gail, Paris Views. Your first book was Out My Window in 2012, which I think you published with Powerhouse. Is that correct? This set of photographs that featured in Paris Views is a very similar series. It shifts the focus from New York to Paris, but features intimate domestic scenes taken through the windows of neighboring buildings. This program, I should tell you, is, as all our programs, supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and in partnership with the City Council and the board and members of the Aperture Foundation. Gail Albert Halaban. Gail, you received an MFA in photography from Yale. You taught at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. I presume you don't do that anymore, and it's correctly in the past tense, as well as ICP and Yale, among other institutions. You've been included in many group and solo exhibitions internationally, and we do consider you very much part of the Aperture community, which we appreciate. We've sold out 2 editions in our print program of prints of yours. I'm delighted also to welcome Amy Adler. Amy is the Emily Kempin Professor of Law at NYU School of Law. You're one of the leading US scholars on art law. At NYU, you teach art law and free speech. You've written prominently and lectured on to a variety of audiences, from attorney generals to the FBI, to art as well as artists. You frequently publish expert opinions in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Art in America. And you've also acted as a witness in high-profile art cases, such as the recent copyright litigation involving Richard Prince. Thank you very much for being with us for a conversation. Thank you, both of you.
So it's such an honor for me to be here because I love this work so much, and I love it because not only is it visually breathtaking, that's the word the New York Times used about this work, but because it's so smart and so contemporary, and really, I think, invites us to think about what it means to see and be seen in contemporary culture. And I'd like to start maybe by talking about a theme that people often start with when they think about Gail's work, and that is the theme of voyeurism. It's something that comes up so often. So, Gail, let's talk about that. People call you a voyeur, your work voyeuristic all the time. Tell us about the theme of voyeurism in your work.
Initially, hi everybody, thanks for coming. Initially, I do think when you look at my pictures, they seem voyeuristic, and I like that. We all like the idea of being voyeurs, even if we don't admit that. It's fun to be a voyeur. But what I think is important to realize about my pictures is they are all staged and set up. So everybody in the picture knows they're being looked at. So their gaze out is as important as my gaze in. So I don't think I'm actually a voyeur, but you have to know what's happening outside of the frame to understand that.
So I think that's one of the things that's surprising about this work, is that we come to it primed with all these expectations about oh my God, we're looking through people's windows, you're spying, we're spying, we're all complicit with you, it's so much fun, it's illicit, it's thrilling, it's wrong. And then we find out that it's a lot more complicated, that the people have consented, that maybe maybe it's not about our voyeurism, but their exhibitionism, or at least some kind of exchange, or something a totally different scenario than our visual culture has primed us to expect when we look at this kind of scene. And it's interesting to me that I think in a lot of ways, your pictures subvert our expectations as viewers. Is that a conscious part of what's going into your work, or?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important to realize that photography, we've always thought of the object of the gaze as a victim. And you shoot a picture, and it's a very violent medium. But I just love to look out my window, and I love to make connections with the people across the way. The whole project started for me in New York when on my daughter's first birthday. Sorry, Chris is looking into it. Can you hear me without me? Yeah. Great. My daughter's first birthday.
Just a little bit. Yeah. What matters.
The project started in New York on my daughter's first birthday when the flower shop across the way sent balloons for Zoe's birthday. And I had never met the people across the way. And we've now developed a very friendly relationship. I've lived there for 10 years. So I know I had been the object of their gaze, but I didn't feel like a victim in that. I felt like we were reflecting each other, and they wanted to know me, I wanted to know them, and there was this constant back and forth that I think really changes the whole power dynamic of photography generally. I have never just taken pictures of people. I feel like I construct a picture, and my subjects are collaborators in that.
You know, it's interesting because you started with this idea of the photograph as shooting. And I actually brought a quote from Susan Sontag because it makes me think about how your work plays with certain conventions or narratives about photography that we now take for granted. And that is the photograph as sort of a violation, as predation, as treachery. And instead here you are taking that and also using photography as a means of community or sharing. So I'm just gonna read you this quote from Sontag and ask you to respond to it, because I do think this is canonical at this point. To photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they never see themselves, by having knowledge of them that they can never have. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. Just as a camera is a sublimation of the gun, to photograph someone is a sublimated murder.
I feel slightly embarrassed to try to contradict Susan Sontag. She is the canon of the history of photography. And I have to admit, for a long time, I thought I wasn't going to become a photographer because I felt like that it was such an aggressive medium. And I wrote my college thesis on the history of social documentary reform photography, and I was always interested in how these photographers were saying they were going to change the world with their pictures, and I realized it was just all propaganda. And I was always bothered by that, and I was going to go to medical school, and I decided, okay, there's got to be some way I can figure this out and become a photographer and still do good in the world. So I was always interested in the idea of community in my pictures. My very first series of photographs was called About 30, and it was photographs of women and how they built their community. And for me, photography has always been about making social connections, but I don't think that is the typical way it is used.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I see the tension in your work. I see that sort of initial reaction of violation, and then the kind of the kind of tease that you play with it. It's like, oh, but there's more to this story, which is part of what I enjoy about the work, is that to experience your work, one has to really look long and hard at it. I want to talk about the theme of privacy. Oh, is my mic okay? Yeah, okay, I want to talk about the theme of privacy, because one of the things that I think makes your work so relevant to contemporary culture is that it really addresses this head on. And we live in a surveillance culture, a culture in which increasingly we're confused and anxious about the boundary between public and private. And this seems to me so central to what you're working on right now. Can you talk about privacy and the privacy of these people in this work and how that plays out?
I think a lot about privacy in my pictures. I'm obviously invading people's spaces even by just looking, and I'm so curious to look at people. But we give up so much of our privacy now. When I order from Seamless Web, they know where I live, they know my credit card number, they know all this profile information of me. Corporations seem to know so much about us. Most of you found out about tonight probably from Facebook. And on the platform of Facebook, there's so much personal information given out. And I feel like my definition of who I am has become the selfies I post online, and it's not anything real anymore. And I crave some separation from knowing people through platforms. The Dalai Lama just made a collaborative effort with Lululemon recently. And I feel like everything we do now is mediated by some corporation. So I really wanted to regain some kind of physical connection. And yes, in a sense, I'm invading people's privacy, but I'm looking out that window and I see people over there. Why shouldn't we have a connection? Why do we need it to be sanctioned by some corporate culture?
I'm just looking at these and wondering, and as I look out windows, your work it makes me think, is that a private space? Is it a public space? What is it when we're in our houses without the shades drawn?
I mean, I have always loved street photography, and I've always felt that, of course, Gary Winogrand had a right to photograph on the street. We're all in public. We're all in a public space, and if you're going to be outside, you are going to be the object of a gaze. Do those people have a right to privacy? I do think we should draw curtains more if we don't want things being seen. But I mean, from a legal perspective, if somebody does not have the expectation of privacy legally, it's not private, I would not take a picture without asking somebody first. I think that's really important. So I don't think the gaze is a violation. I think taking a picture without somebody's permission is overstepping a line that I wouldn't overstep, even though legally in the US I could, but legally in Paris I couldn't. You're absolutely not allowed to take a picture through somebody's window without their permission in France.
It almost makes me think we imagine our windows are like screens that screen out the world and just go on living, particularly as New Yorkers, go on living as if no one can see.
Right. I mean, there is this sort of fragile sense where you feel protected by it. It does seem like there's this border between you and the outside world, that the window protects you in some way. We should have said this in the introduction, but I have photographed from Amy's windows for years and years because she lives across a building that's all glass in Chelsea with everything you would expect a glass building in Chelsea to contain. And all the neighbors have been very receptive to being photographed, but often have changed their displays after the pictures have been made. And they've been much more aware that there's a kid living across the street and much more private. So I do think we do think there is this protection from the window, but my bigger question is, what are we protecting ourselves against? Like, tonight's the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, and it's exactly 2 years from when I went to Paris to begin this project. And I realized that week how important neighbors are to you. Like, why do we want our privacy so much from our neighbors? Because that week we really needed them. You wanted to know who had power. You wanted to know who had running water. You wanted to know that if you had an emergency, there was somebody looking out for you. So I think regaining this connection with our neighbors is so important. And I feel like it's particularly important right now where we don't go to a coffee shop and run into our friends. I mean, today I was sitting at a coffee shop and a friend walked by and she had her headphones on, and I kept yelling to her, "Oh, Lee, hi," and she didn't see me, and she was a friend from high school I hadn't seen in years, and I realized that connection could have been so easily missed because we're all involved in our headphones or our screens, and
Yeah, we're in our sort of digital networked culture. We're walking by each other, looking at our screens, and that's our network now. And so it's sort of
and
this
I want to
interesting-
reclaim some physical culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the New York Times used a photograph of yours as an illustration of Instagram culture. And I was wondering how you respond to that and how you feel about using Instagram for your work and what your place is as a photographer in a digital networked culture.
Instagram has completely changed how I approach photography. I have taken, Kate Sullivan is in this picture and she's here tonight, as are our children, Zoe and Sam. Instagram has completely changed how I approach photography. I feel like there's so much information now, and people are taking so many pictures so quickly and just posting them up without thought that I've kind of gone the other direction. And I carefully considered sort of what are the main ingredients in photography, and it's light and time. And I'm going to slow down and really pay attention to those things. So I use light and time to make my pictures. My pictures take a very long time to make. They're carefully constructed. I photograph them at a very specific moment where I feel like everything comes together in the way a film director would do it. So I'm not just catching an instant. And so in the process of making these pictures very slowly, I think I'm giving my viewer an opportunity to look at something much more slowly. And the pictures are never what they seem on first look. And I think that's kind of the difference between me and Instagram. Like, I feel like Instagram is like almost like a quick note. And my pictures, I feel like I've choreographed so many different moments and paid attention to so many different details that they all come together. But I do think Instagram has changed our relationship to privacy, and I do feel like nobody expects it anymore because everything's being documented, and that's kind of fascinating to me.
It just strikes me that thinking about your work and what you were saying about connection and community, that you're making work about a very different kind of social network, and yet, about a physical social network. And it's interesting to me that you're making this, I think that we've talked about this, that the physical material photograph is very important to you. But I'm looking at your pictures and I can't help but see them also. The window is kind of this multiplication of screens coming up. I think that's just, maybe Instagram has changed the way I see windows now.
But it's actually interesting that we say we're looking at my pictures, because we're not looking at my pictures. Like, my pictures are these big physical framed objects. We are looking at reproductions of my pictures, and that's really interesting. And the fact that we're looking at it on a screen, like, everything we do is mediated. And it's like, so often people are like, oh yeah, I've seen your pictures, I saw them online, but those aren't them. It is a physical object. They're these big physical objects that you're supposed to live with, and if you live with them, you start to really make friends with the people in the pictures, and they remedy this feeling of disassociation and disconnection just by inhabiting your space.
Just strikes me that one of the interesting things about your work, and maybe most radical, is this reclaiming of the physical in a virtual moment, of the physical photograph, of sort of a questioning of the digital. So let me see. Oh, I wanted to talk about the radical subject matter of your work, to the extent that you're interested in domesticity. It strikes me that that's kind of transgressive. As a woman photographer in what we might call a post-feminist era, here you are photographing domestic spaces and it's a subject that's sacred, but also I think mundane and trivial. What does it mean for you your interest in domesticity?
I'm interested in domesticity on so many levels. First of all, I'm really interested as a woman photographer looking at women, and I always have been. And I'm interested in reclaiming the power of doing the domestic chore. I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be home and taking care of your children. And one thing that's people have often been surprised at in my work, of mothers, all the women in my work have always been these strong, powerful women who happen to also have domestic lives too. And I feel like there's so many cultures right now where women are hidden and women don't have power. And so I want to say, like, these people are important. It matters what they're doing. It doesn't mean they're not also investment bankers or lawyers or doctors, but doing the domestic is part of who they are. And it's interesting tonight. I mean, you're here. I know you from Yale, but I also know you through our kids. And there are a lot of people here I know through kids. So I think there's often, as a woman photographer, I'm not supposed to admit that my kids are a big part of my career, but they've inspired so much of what I do. I think I have photographed the domestic in a context that everybody can connect to. We all have families, we all have interior lives. So I don't think I photograph women in a way where it's just about the women, but they are major characters in my work.
I want to talk about influences. And your work is addressing all of these contemporary themes, but they're also interesting classical references. Many people talk about your work as Hopperesque. I know that the New Yorker, in a rave review of her work, by the way, the New Yorker, compared her very favorably to Hopper. So let's talk about Hopper and who else matters to you and as influences or references.
So the last show I had, the series of New York pictures, or 2 shows ago, everybody was comparing me to Edward Hopper and Alfred Hitchcock. And neither of those had I actually honestly paid that much attention to. But Hopper really fascinated me because he painted so much in New York, and he also painted mostly in a town in Massachusetts, Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I had spent all of my childhood. So I felt like subconsciously I was probably influenced by some of the same things he was influenced by, and I wanted to go back and investigate it. So what I did was I re-photographed the exact places Edward Hopper painted from a much more contemporary perspective, sort of how would Hopper see it now. And again, it became much more about connection to me. Hopper always painted people very isolated from the urban environment. This was a town I had spent my childhood in that didn't know how important Edward Hopper had been to the community. So I had to go do the research and meet the people and connect with them and explain. Those people had no idea who Edward Hopper was. I had to explain who he was to them and convince them to let me photograph them. So that process of connection became really important. So Hopper was a major influence. Another big influence for me is 16th century Dutch painting. I like the window in Dutch painting generally, but I really like painters like Bruegel. That's 19th century Northern European painting. But Bruegel, for example, because I love how he populates the landscape with small figures, and I feel like that's something I've always tried to do, is kind of combine the ordinary quotidian gesture with the landscape. But back to the other picture, I'm also very interested in the Romantic paintings of 19th century Northern Europe. And that work interests me because I feel like what's in the distance is always more interesting than what's up close. Sort of like what's hidden far away is what's interesting. And I've always been interested in what's hidden, what's not easily found. So that work has inspired me a lot.
You know, you and I once talked about how important Gary Winogrand was to you. Can you say more about that? I find that an interesting reference.
I love street photography. I feel like another project you know about, which a lot of people here don't know, is I photograph a lot of pictures of kids and technology. I'm really interested in technology and how it's in our life right now, and I also do a lot of street photography, and I realize street photography is dead right now because nobody's interacting on the street anymore. It's so frustrating. You go on the street and people are bumping into each other and not paying attention. So I've always thought to myself as like, what would Gary Winogrand do now? And I feel like he would go a couple levels up. And the street has become this interaction that happens above.
It's funny. It's the place where we're it's the only place we're unguarded.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So this is maybe this is exactly
Yeah.
where
I mean,
Winogrand
to
would
me,
look.
this is Winogrand would have done this.
That's great. That's great. Winogrand just moved up a few
Yeah. Exactly.
upstate stories. It's fabulous. Okay, so let's talk. I want to talk about your new work because I think it's super interesting. And I don't know if there's a picture.
Can you back up to? There was one like 2 or 3 back with a computer in it.
Yeah, there's a picture where you see. Maybe Gail can explain it. But,
Yeah, there it is.
Oh yeah, this one. Okay.
So this is the one picture in the book that is completely different than all the other pictures. If you'll see in the bottom right here, that's me on the computer. And I'm actually photographing from my desk in New York. So when I was in Paris, this guy was not available to be photographed. And I wanted to photograph. I had photographed from his apartment to his neighbor, and I wanted to photograph back the other way, but he couldn't do it when I was there. So what I did is I set up the camera and explained to the resident of the apartment where I would want the camera to be. And then I went back home to New York, and then when they could find a date that they could both photograph, they connected the camera to their computer, and I operated it remotely from New York. And so I'm Skyping with him, and I'm also Skyping with the person who's looking at him. So it's become this 3-way connection. And right now I'm doing that all over the world. So I've done one in Bangkok, I've done one in Berlin. I love photographing in Amsterdam, and there'll be an exciting story in Geo coming out of a similar project I just done in December. But this is sort of how I want to travel and see the world. Because it's just how you can't go everywhere, and this is such a great way to get invited into people's homes and see them remotely. And so I'm interested in the difference between the being there and photographing and the photographing remotely and how that's different.
And again, it just seems to me such a great way to think about contemporary culture and sort of the absence and presence that digital spaces invite us to occupy. And I think about this work, and I love that picture. That's you, right, in that screen, in that little, in that screen you can see Gail a little bit. And I loved it because it brings to the fore, to me, stuff that's already present in this work, themes about authorship and who is the author, and you're there, but you're not there. And again, you know, ideas of surveillance. You're being seen and seeing. I just love what's going on. And
Can
again,
I make a comment? That's the Alfred Hitchcock part of your influence.
yeah, but it's a little twisted. I mean, not that anyone's more twisted than Hitchcock, but it's a twist on Hitchcock, right? Because I guess that she's there.
Yeah,
I see.
she's there.
Yeah. That's great. So you don't have any pictures of the new work yet, do you?
It's still top secret.
Oh. Something to wait for. Well, I want to throw it out to the audience, but I did, just in looking through Gail's book and thinking about tonight, I just jotted down, I started making a series of notes, and I just want to read very quickly these notes I jotted down, and I'm sure you guys have more about them. But one of the things I love about this work is just I'm really grateful for the complexity, sort of inside and outside, and straddling this kind of undecidable space. And I just wrote down some of the binaries that your work raises for us and doesn't resolve in a way that I find so resonant. So voyeurism and exhibitionism violation and consent, surveillance and display, inside outside, private public, domestic urban, concealed revealed, photographic painterly, microscopic telescopic, accidental posed, true false, masculine feminine, we didn't talk about that, but I think it's there, and seeing and being seen, and lots more. So anyway, with that, I'd love to invite people from the audience to ask Gail more about the work.
I do have a question. So in the New York work, I remember when you talked about the moment that the work changed from looking out the window to looking in the window. And I see that in some of these Paris shots, there are a couple that look out the window again. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that inside-outside.
So I think the French are really good with the terms to describe art in a way Americans are not. But there's this term in French, mise en abîme, where it's sort of like the barbershop mirror. Everything goes back and forth and back and forth. And those pictures are there to kind of make the viewer realize that I am not just a voyeur, but somebody's looking back. And there's always this play between in and out and in and out. And the looker is as important as the object of the gaze.
You talked about the complexity of setting up these scenes, but you didn't tell us anything about how you actually do it. I mean, can you just talk us through one picture and what's involved? I mean, there's obviously lots of relationships, lots of consents. I mean, maybe it's obvious, but at the same
Yeah,
time...
it's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it, because I think when the interns asked it earlier, and there's so many things I take for granted because I know how they're made. But they are incredibly complicated to make. So first, what I do is, we should really back up where this whole project started as an assignment for Le Monde, a magazine of Le Monde, the week before Hurricane Sandy, and they said, come next week and photograph 10 pictures, and it's going to be the cover of the magazine. And this was after spending 5 years doing it in New York. So to do it in a week was crazy. So I got on a plane and I went to Paris knowing nobody. And in that week, the editors of the magazine helped me find 10 people who saw their neighbors' windows. And we got permission from those 10. And from those 10, we created a Facebook page, or I created a Facebook page, and I said, who knows their neighbors, and will you go ask them if I can take their picture? So all these people, in advance of my coming, had gotten permission from their neighbors for me to photograph. And then I had to go to Paris and I had to scout and see if you could really see. Then I would set up a time to shoot. I would place lights across the way, and I'd photograph from one apartment to the other, and if the light allowed or the angle allowed, I'd go and photograph the reverse angle. So this project ended up taking exactly 1 year to make 70 pictures, and I was mostly in New York, so it was, I think, 6 weeks in, just 6 weeks in Paris, so it was a lot of pre-production from here.
Can I ask That's the other thing that's very striking about your pictures. They're so perfectly lit. I mean, every picture doesn't look, they look like movie stills. They look like every element of the lighting has been controlled and supervised. But clearly you can't light the outside of buildings for your pictures. But I mean, in each of these interior scenes, have you added lights to...
Yeah, so all the windows that you see are lit. And the outside, I don't light them, but I do wait for that perfect moment. So I usually only make 2 pictures a day. And this is not in the book. I usually only make 2 pictures a day, so I'm sort of waiting for that perfect moment.
Actually, have a follow-up to your question. And Gail, you were talking about collaboration with your subjects. So I'm interested in that. I mean, how do they participate? Do they have a say in how they'll be showcased and how they want to be perceived? So that's my first one.
So I think of the subjects as 2 sides. There's the person I'm shooting from and the person I am shooting. The person I'm shooting from tends to give me much more creative input than the person I'm shooting, so they tell me what they've seen their neighbor do. Then we ask their neighbor to recreate those kinds of situations, and usually that works out fine. I think the process of, I tend to let people be very free in what they do when I'm photographing them, but not when I'm editing. So there are a lot of pictures that didn't make the book because I didn't feel like what they were doing was necessarily the friendly neighbor thing to have seen. So I do try to keep it friendly and G-rated.
And then I'll pass the microphone, but just to comment on that. For me, it's a lot of bringing awareness. And so you sort of, for better or for worse, taking away the unrealistic expectations that no one can see you and the naivete that you're just, that you're in the privacy of your house. By the way, I think a lot of them don't have curtains. So if you don't have a curtain, maybe the privacy issue is not relevant. But the awareness brings change in behavior. And so you're having an impact, most probably.
Oh,
and this
absolutely.
project is having an impact on subject and
But I think the awareness that people mostly had was how mundane what we all do is, and that we're all doing the same thing. So I think the main awareness is kind of how connected we are, not how, think about what you do in your kitchen. It's really not that terrifying to show somebody else. And particularly in France, you probably know more about this than I do because you're French, but it doesn't seem like very private spaces are in front of windows. Often it's the more public rooms that have windows, and the bedrooms seem kind of a little more hidden. People don't have their bed in front of windows there as much as here. There aren't as many first floor apartments. And most people do have curtains, and the French curtains tend to be very heavy and really block out the world. They definitely do have more of a sense of privacy when their curtains are drawn than we do. And look, most of us have these kind of shades where you can kind of see a silhouette through. There, when they close off, they're really closing off.
See if I can cover that mic. In a way, your comment just sort of anticipated this question, but were there any striking contrasts or differences between the New York work and the Paris work, or particular differences that were surprising to you?
There's so many differences between the 2 bodies of work. I have to admit, when I first got the assignment to go, I hadn't been to Paris in like 20 years and I really wanted to go, but I almost turned it down because I was like, I already did that. I already shot through windows. It's going to be the same thing all over again. It was completely different on so many levels. First of all, the relationships between neighbors in Paris and New York is incredibly different. Like here, your neighbor moves in. My neighbor came and brought vodka down the other day, and you'll just stop by and you'll be friendly. You would never just stop by a neighbor in Paris. So the openness between the relationships with neighbors here versus there was huge. So people in France thought this was such a radical idea. They were like, there's just no way you're going to do it. You're going to get sued. It's not going to work. So that was the big thing, was how different the relationships were, and I just realized how cultural that was. You don't go into somebody's private space ever in a Paris apartment. No matter how well you know somebody, you are never invited into the kitchen or the bedroom. Here, I feel like everybody wants to show off their apartment. We're so happy if we have more than one room. The other thing is the architecture of Paris is made to look. they have big picture windows, and the angles of the streets kind of force you to look into your neighbor's window, but nobody will admit it. And I don't know if they're looking away or they're just denying it, but they pretend like they don't look. So acknowledging that gaze was such a big part of this work for me.
So does that mean, you mentioned Amsterdam, you mentioned other countries, does that mean as you apply this project's kind of parameters to other places, you're actually learning about a lot of different behavioral aspects of different places?
Absolutely. I mean, I kind of think of myself as an anthropologist to some extent. I mean, in the Dutch window is, speaking of domesticity, the women in Holland sort of, particularly in late 19th century, where the window became this thing where you could show off your domestic successes. And women would lean out their windows as a way of being seen. The window in so many different cultures is an important thing, and I've been trying to photograph in the Middle East, and it's really hard because you're not supposed to see the private spaces. So yeah, I'm learning tons about cultural difference through the project, and I had no idea. I mean, a window is glass. It's clear. It's a stage in a sense. In New York, it's certainly a stage, but it's a protective barrier in a lot of places.
Which leads me to my question, which is that I've not seen where you've had open windows before. Like maybe I don't know all of your work, but in these photographs, you do have a lot of open windows, which kind of breaks that barrier in a different way. So
Absolutely. One, it's in Paris, people have cross ventilation and they don't put those ugly air conditioners in their windows, so they just open their windows more. But it was very interesting. Then people are very conscious of their volume, so it became not just about looking, but they would talk very quietly if their windows were open. So there was this other layer of connection and disconnection that happened when the window was open, which I think of in Rome when people have their windows open, they're like yelling across to their neighbors and commenting on each other.
Are the windows always clean?
Who asked that, Lynn?
Yeah.
No, that's actually was the hardest part in Paris, because when the windows get dirty, there's also these old, like, bubbly windows, and the camera I use has so much resolution that in the prints you can see all the dirt on the windows, and it was hard.
So you have to send a window cleaner out as well?
I cleaned a lot of windows.
So you said that you used what the neighbors across the way say about the people.
Mm-hmm.
So that the kid, for instance, playing the clarinet, you didn't put a clarinet in.
No, the neighbors always heard the music playing, and so when they agreed, they're like, oh, but those girls have to be playing their instruments.
And then are you able to direct the people?
Yes, so we're all on a group, either conference call or Skype when I'm doing it, which is the hard part of the worldwide project, because right now I'm limited to places that have good Wi-Fi.